One of the great Psalms is Psalm 2. It's a messianic psalm, and I've been encouraged by some of my students to read this psalm in Hebrew, verse by verse, with translation into English, and then a brief commentary. And as I look at this, I'll be commenting as a Christian minister, retired seminary professor, and also trying to understand how others have understood the psalm, but then how it's applied in the New Testament, how it's applied to Christ in New Testament thought. So I'm going to read it. It's a psalm that has to do with a plot against the king that was being anointed. And in the psalm, we have different movements where there is this plot to don't let this one rule over us. Let us break their bands asunder, followed then by the Lord in heaven, followed then by what the king says, that the decree that has been given to him by the Lord, and then finally the psalmist telling the rebelling kings to cool the rebellion or stop the rebellion. So we begin in verse 1. Lama rakashu goyim ula umim yagu rik. Why are the nations in an uproar? And why do the peoples mutter a vain thing? Yatsavu malchei eretz v'rozanim nosadu yachad al Adonai v'al Mashiach. The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Nenatika et moserotemo, v'nashlicha mimenu avotemo. Let us break their bands asunder. Let us cast their cords from us. This is the first movement of the psalm. It's looking at the kings that are planning an attack and a revolt against the king that's being coronated. By the way, this psalm, according to Rashi, a medieval Jewish commentator, understands it to have reference to 2 Samuel 5, verse 17, where when the Philistines heard that David was anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up to seek David. Rashi takes that to be the historical context. In rabbinic circles, in at least some rabbinic circles, they relate this to King Messiah, the future, coming Mashiach. And as we look at these verses in New Testament interpretation, first of all, let me just talk a little bit about the text. The kings of the earth are taking up a counsel against what the Lord is doing. And they're meditating a vain thing. The word meditate is the word yegu. It's the same Hebrew word used in Psalm 1, where the godly man, yeget, meditates in the Torah yomam v'layla, by day and night. So in the Talmud, these two texts are related to one another. And we have that parallel in the word there. And happy are all who take refuge in him. Ashrei kol chosevo. At the end, we also have in Psalm 1, Ashrei ha'ish, happy is the man. So again, the Psalm 1 begins with Ashrei, happy, and Psalm 2 ends with Ashrei, happy. And so again, in the Talmud, they relate these two psalms together, David beginning with the idea of being happy or happiness in both, places. But then as we go on, we don't know the exact historical context. When I was in seminary, My professor talked about this as an indirectly messianic psalm, seen through New Testament lenses. It has its own historical time of coronation, but then its final application is prophetic in New Testament thinking and belief and theology. And so this first movement, where they want to break asunder the coronation of this king and not allow it to happen, is then applied not only historically at a time when this was going on, possibly as Rashi suggested, but in New Testament thought, it refers to Christ and the crucifixion. In Acts chapter 4, this text is quoted by Luke. Why do the nations rage and the peoples meditate a vain thing? The kings of the earth station themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his Christou, against his Christ. By the way, the Septuagint is being translated here in the New Testament, and the word anointed is Christou in the Greek Septuagint and also is used here. We're told in Luke, for they were gathered together in that city against your holy child Jesus, whom you anointed, Herod and Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and peoples of Israel, to do whatsoever your hand and your will had predetermined or foreordained to occur. So in other words, the first movement in New Testament application applies to the cross of Christ. Then we move from verses 4 to 6, and I'll read the Hebrew and talk about each verse just briefly. Notice in verse 4, it reads, Yoshev Bashamayim Yischak, Adonai Yul'ag Lamo. That is, the one who sits in the heavens will laugh. The Lord will hold them in derision, or will mock at them, laugh at them. That is, then he will speak unto them in his wrath, and in his anger he will terrify them. Again, we see God now sitting on his throne, having it all under control, and then God thunders. He speaks. While they are muttering under the breath, the kings, he speaks. He is the sovereign throne setter, the psalmist is saying. And notice what God says. Verse 6, Va'ani nasachti malki al Sion har kodshi. But I, very emphatic here, I have established my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. Notice the emphasis on the personal pronoun I, and then we have it repeated in the suffix nasakti. I have established or installed. I have done this is the emphasis of the text. And I've set my king upon Zion, my holy mountain. So God is determined that his king is going to be coronated, that's being coronated, is going to reign on his holy mountain in Jerusalem. That's the historic context. Whatever, can I say, coronation it was, whether it was, at the time that Rashi suggested, whether it was at another time, basically God is determined that his king will reign. Now, having said that, we then move from 7 to 9. And it's interesting that in the book of Acts, it talks about that which God had predetermined to occur. Speaking of the crucifixion, anticipating, can I say, the resurrection in New Testament theology. But let's go on in verses 7 to 9. Now the king speaks, and he is going to describe what the Lord has said. Verse 7, Asapra elcho, Adonai amar Eli beniyata, Ani hayom yeliticha. I will declare the decree. The Lord said unto me, you are my son. I today have given birth to you. In other words, very vivid in Hebrew. Uh, you are my son, and this decree that's etched in stone, I today have given birth. Sha'al mimeni v'tana goyim nachalatecha v'achuzatecha afse aretz. That is, ask from me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth, or the ends of the earth, for your possession. Notice the psalmist is simply seeing the king as addressing God the Father, who has said, all you have to do is ask of me, and I'll give you the nations for your inheritance, the uttermost parts of the earth for your possession. And then verse 9, Teruim b'shevet barzel kikli yotzer N.T.application. You will break them with the rod of iron, and as vessels of a potter, you will dash them to pieces. As a potter's vessel, you will dash them to pieces. Notice in verses 8, all you have to do is ask of me, the psalmist is saying, and I'll give you all the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. And you will crush them with an iron scepter. You will dash them to pieces like a potter's vessel. Now it's interesting when we look at the historical background in verse 7, where it says, you are my son. In the ancient Near East, when a king was being coronated, that kind of, can I say, phraseology was used. We see it in Ugaritic text when a king was being crowned. And so, my son, you are, the coronation day was the day of the crowning of the king. And what the text is saying historically, all you have to do is ask of me, and I'm going to give you the nations for your inheritance, and the ends of the earth for your possession. And if they continue to rebel, the psalmist is saying, you will crush them with an iron scepter, as a potter's vessel, you will dash them to pieces. In terms of New Testament thought, what is exciting here is that in the in the book of Acts, again, today I have begotten you. You are my son. The Apostle Paul, preaching a sermon, and it's recorded in the book of Acts, applies that to the resurrection in Acts chapter 13, verse 33. It quotes this text and says that God has fulfilled this promise that he made concerning the Messiah by raising Jesus from the dead. And notice Paul goes on when he says, as it is spoken in the second Psalm, you are my son. I today have given birth to you. And he goes on to talk about that he rose him from the dead. He's no longer about to die. He quotes from the Psalm 16, and also I will give you the sure mercies of David, which is a quote again from the Hebrew scriptures about how God has promised David that one would sit upon his throne forever. And so this great promise, this by the way, was a reference to Isaiah 55 verse 3 in the Septuagint. In other words, the thought is that David, Luke writes, and going back no doubt to what Paul had preached, in his own generation, when he had ministered by the will of God, fell asleep and was placed with his fathers, and he saw corruption. But he whom God raised, that is Jesus, did not see corruption. So he goes on to then talk about how Jesus Christ was coronated at the resurrection. So can we say the resurrection of Christ in New Testament theology is the coronation day when he was resurrected? He is also heir of all things, because ask of me and I'll give you the nations for your inheritance. The writer of Hebrews in Hebrews 1 speaks of Christ as the heir of all things. And then you will crush them with an iron scepter. It is interesting that when we go to the New Testament in Acts chapter 19, historically it was talking about the authority that the Israeli king would have over the rebelling kinglet, so to speak. But in the New Testament, it's applied to the second advent of Christ. For example, in Revelation chapter 19, Jesus is picturing coming back on a white horse, which was a symbol of a victorious king. And the text says there will be a sharp two-edged sword coming out of his mouth, which pictures his word. And he will poimene, he will shepherd the nations with an iron scepter. It's interesting that the New Testament refers to the Septuagint because in the Hebrew, teruim b'shevet barzel, you could translate that either as you will crush with a rod of iron the nations, so to speak. You will crush them with a rod of iron, and you will dash them to pieces as a potter's vessel. And if we take the translation crush, it's from ra'ah, a double ayin root that means to crush. However, the text without the vowels, instead of being read teruim, could have been read tir'im, from resh ayin hey instead of resh ayin ayin, and that means to shepherd. And so it's my thought that the Septuagint translators rendered this as to shepherd. Ra'ah, seeing the root to be resh ayin hey, a final lamed hey verb, rather than a double ayin verb, rather than resh ayin ayin. And so I'm thinking that the Septuagint then translated it as you will shepherd them with an iron scepter. And it's interesting, the New Testament follows that rendition of the Septuagint, poimene. And I think what's interesting to me is that when you look at the ancient Near East, at Akkadian texts, for example, a king would shepherd his people, but he would also judge those that were opponents to his people as a shepherd, as a shepherding type king. So it had a dual kind of imagery, shepherding his own, like a shepherd shepherding sheep, but also rendering judgment. And so I'm thinking that the Septuagint then rendered this to shepherd from resh ayin hey, and the New Testament follows that by going back to poimene, which means to shepherd, quoting the Septuagint. So Christ is coming back as the final shepherd king, but yet judge in that sense, at least in New Testament belief and thought in chapter 19 of the book of Revelation. So having said that, we then come to the exhortation to these that are planning revolt to cool the rebellion. Notice the text says in verses 10 to 12, V'ata melachim haskilu, hivasru shofate aretz. That is, and now kings, be wise, be instructed, or be admonished, judges of the earth. Ivdu et Adonai beyirah begilu biradah. That is, serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. In other words, rejoice in him, but not with rebellion anymore, as to what he's doing in the coronation. And then it reads, Nashkuvar penya anaf betovadu derek ki yiv'ar kim'at apo. Ashrei kol chosei vo. And I'm going to translate this, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, when his wrath is quickly kindled. Happy are all who take refuge in him. Here we have that Josevo going back to taking refuge and being happy in the Torah in chapter 1. But at any rate, this verse 12 is a debated verse. In Jewish interpretation or rabbinic interpretation, they would render it, do homage in purity. And it is interesting, the word var can mean pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, Jesus said, but you have that same reference to var in chapter 24 in the Psalm, speaking of the pure in heart. In Psalm chapter 24, another great psalm, by the way, where that adjective is used. And we could translate that something then like do homage in purity if one was following that understanding. I understand it differently. I would render it kiss the Son. In other words, by the way, in chapter 24, verse 4, it reads, he who has clean hands, naki chapayim, uvar levav, and pure of heart. There we have that bar, meaning pure. So that's where some want to render it kiss with purity, or excuse me, do homage in purity. I would prefer the translation kiss the Son. Nashak can mean to kiss, and bar is an Aramaic word for son. The normal word for son is bin in Hebrew. However, the word bar is a rare word in the Hebrew Bible for son. We find it in the Proverbs, the same thought, bar, in Proverbs chapter 30, I believe it is, where we have the word bar being used for son. So I'm thinking that I would prefer rendering this kiss the Son, nashku bar, pin. It is interesting that commentators have pointed out if you had bin, nashku bin, pin, that possibly the writer, the psalmist writer, wanted to use a dissimilation in choosing the word bar rather than the word bin. In other words, nashku bin pin is sort of, I guess you would say, a little bit strange in sound, where nashku bar pin, it's my understanding that the word bar then is being italicized. Kiss the bar, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way. Using an Aramaic word, but also a rare Hebrew use of son as bar, and because of dissimilation in possibly writing this psalm, I would render it then, kiss the Son. And again, I believe when we look at the New Testament, Jesus is the Son of God. And the New Testament talks about his coronation as God's Son on the throne of David. And so as I'm looking at this, I'm thinking many of the Puritans who would end their sermons with kiss the Son. That is, kiss Christ and love him and believe in him. Bow down before him as the coronated king. And that would be my take on it and my own translation of this phrase. What a beautiful text. Looking at Christology, I believe, from the cross to the resurrection, the raging upon the cross, the resurrection, the coronation day of our Lord Jesus Christ, that he's heir of all things, and that he will shepherd the nations with an iron scepter at his second advent. And I believe, as the Puritans said, let us kiss the Son.